Well, for those of you who have your mics muted, I'm just going to start here. And we're going to actually start with introductions. If all participants could, we have how many?
2 up right now, and then we had NHSC was connected to.
Okay. And we're recording this, so it can be watched at a later time. So, right, there we have a couple other people. If you could introduce yourself with your tribe or your background, and if you've had any research experience, and whether that was good, bad, or indifferent. And do you know if your tribe has either an institutional review board or a tribal specific review board? I'll start.
We have Dr. Vest and then Amber Finley.
Okay, Amber, can you introduce yourself?
She says she has no mic.
Oh, okay, never mind. Dr. Best?
Yeah, I'm from the tribe of genetic researchers, and my experience has generally been good.
Okay. Allison?
Hi, I'm a graduate assistant for the INBRE program here. And we don't have a formal IRB for INBRE yet, but we're working on one for the project coming up.
Great. And I'm Dr. Siobhan Wescott. I just go by Siobhan if you have questions. I'm an Athabascan from Fairbanks, Alaska, and I've had quite a bit of trouble with research, actually with IRBs, getting IRB approval and that holding up projects. But nonetheless, I still believe that tribes should own their data, and it's worth the trouble. So to go over what we're going to talk about in this hour is why we need tribal protection versus just human subject protection. So for those of you who are maybe not as familiar, there's a couple of reasons that we have human subject protections in the form of institutional review boards. So the first, and I'm not going to go over a lot of details here because it's truly inhumane things that were done to prisoners of war by the Nazis, but that led to an early example of sort of what are the ethical principles of research, and that is informed consent. That came out originally in the Nuremberg Code, and then later in the 70s with the Belmont Report. So the reason that that's important is that it set up the idea that essentially researchers, for the most part, are good people, but it's easy to go astray, and that people should be given the choice. And this was reinforced by around the same time as the Belmont Report in the 70s, when it came to light about the Tuskegee story. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a study that started in 1932 in Tuskegee, Alabama, I think it is. And at the time, it was arguably ethical. It was clear in European studies what syphilis does to someone if untreated, because at the time there really wasn't any treatment. So they wanted there was a high rate of syphilis among African Americans, so they wanted to see what would happen by studying African Americans with syphilis, see if it was different from what they had known about Europeans. Well, so for the first 10 years or so, it was probably ethical. However, they never informed the patients what was happening. They were simply told that they had bad blood, and they were not aware that they weren't being treated. So then penicillin comes along in the 40s, and suddenly syphilis is extremely treatable. And this is where the study went horribly wrong. So they did not decide to treat the participants in the study, and they actively prevented them from getting treatment elsewhere. This is I'm saying this in a calm voice because that's just my voice, but that's really like one of the worst things that you could do, because it not only, syphilis, it's not just causing a fever, it can lead to death, it can make life miserable with neurotoxicity and just a lot of organ systems that are affected, as well as, you know, the study design, because they didn't tell the patients, there was no opportunity then to tell the patient's partners, who then could contract syphilis and pass it on to their children. So this is really flabbergasting to think that it occurred to none of these researchers that what they were doing was wrong. And in fact, it wasn't any of them who had a sudden awareness of consciousness. It was another researcher who heard them presenting and said, "This is ridiculous, what are you doing?" And it took several years, and it was ultimately broken by a reporter before the Public Health Service said, "Hey, wait a minute, what's going on here?" So that's why we not only have human protections, but it's all very important to have informed consent. So the basic definition then of human subject protection is to protect not only the rights, but the well-being of anyone participating in research. Further, it's also to check all the boxes and make sure that there's both legal, scientific, and lastly, ethical soundness in any research design. And that may seem fairly straightforward, but it gets complicated very quickly. So that's the basics of why we have institutional review boards, or IRBs. But any country is unique. So more recently for us, and I'd ask for a show of hands, but shake your head even though I can't see you if you've heard of the Havasupai case. And just think for a moment of how bad that was, and then I'll just go through a summary to remind us. So it was an Arizona State University professor who is in genetics, and it was Dr. Markow, and she was invited by an anthropologist at Arizona State to work with the Havasupai tribe, which consists of only 650 people-ish, and they're in a very isolated community at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So, for instance, you can't drive there. You have to stop at a certain road and then proceed by foot down to this community. So there's a high rate of poverty and a high rate of diabetes, as well as other diseases. So the idea was the community had reached out to this anthropologist whom they had a good rapport with to say, you know, can't we study diabetes? Can we figure out why so many of us have diabetes? And that got morphed into a genetic study. So it started in 1989, and there was both Arizona State University IRB approval, so that's a good thing. And there was also Indian Health Service IRB approval, which is also a good thing. But the procedures weren't well followed, and there's some, because it became a lawsuit, it's really hard to tell what actually happened. But it seems clear that they were only getting oral consents for a good period of time, which if you're going to draw blood for genetic analysis is terrible. I don't even know how to describe how wrong that is. You can get oral consent for relatively or for risks that are no more than everyday life. So, for instance, I'm going to be doing an evaluation of a health education video. So, you know, there's lots of things on TV that are very similar, so that's not really much more of a risk than everyday life. But if you're taking someone's blood and going to run genetic analysis, and that has implications potentially for identifiability, especially if you're in a small community of 650 people in an isolated location, That's wrong. So then slowly the tribes started saying, what's going on here? And it turns out that there was some efforts at Arizona State University to study not the genetics of diabetes, but the genetics of schizophrenia in this population, which has not been approved by the tribe, not been consented for by the patients as far as we know, because it was done orally. So there was no paper trail to follow. As well as looking at migration patterns, which affects the tribes. I mean, they have ways that they understand how they came to live where they live that are tribal specific, a part of their culture. So to say, well, we think you're related to this group and that group, so you must have migrated in this time period, that's not what they wanted, and it was done without their permission. It seemed to be that the people who were doing that research were following the letter of the IRB restrictions. So they said things like, well, sure, we sent this genetic data all over the world, but we kept the folder with the identifying information at Arizona State University, so we didn't send anything identifiable. But when you're dealing with a tribe of 650 people, that is inherently identifiable. But they argued, hey, we followed what we were supposed to do. Ish. Again, it's one of my favorite words. So the case was settled in 2010, but there were lots of reverberations, not just for the tribe, who now refuses to allow anyone to research them. I don't necessarily blame them. Apparently, though, there's also many of the tribal members who don't want to pursue health care for diabetes specifically because of this experience. So it's harming them now. But it's one of the most egregious examples of how things can go wrong in Indian country. And a case study for genetics, not just for Indian country, but genetics in general. I don't know if Dr. Best, if you have any experience with people talking about Havasupai?
No, it just, from what I've heard, much as you've outlined.
Yeah, and there's a perception, I don't know how correct it is, that Indians in America are more genetically pure than other groups, so therefore a good starting place for a lot of genetic studies. And in Havasupai, they really were focused on trying to see if there was enough genetic variation to look for a gene that might be involved with diabetes or other diseases that they didn't ever publish on, but were done without approval. And it wasn't, even in that small isolated community, they didn't have a target gene. They didn't find one. So I think that also is attacking this perception that perhaps Indians are really good for genetic studies. It's also something of a self-fulfilling prophecy that because of Havasupai now, Indians don't want to be involved in genetic studies. And there are some Native researchers who are doing a good job of building a relationship with the tribe before the topic of genetics and research come up, and it's often some of the best work is being done in cancer studies, but it's very delicate because of this case. So again, it's just emphasizing that not only do you need to protect any single patient whose blood was taken after they were only told what the study might be that was probably misleading, but that because you're dealing with a small identifiable community, that you can't just rely on human subject protection, that you need to be thinking about tribal community protection. It's very different. That is no legal basis in the U.S. Now, Havasupai is well known. I think a lesser known case is from Alaska, where I'm also from, and put up the slide here. By the way, Alaska, so think of this as like Detroit, and this would be Atlanta, so it's quite a distance. But this is the international date line. So here it's today, and there it's tomorrow. And so a very clever med student submitted and was published an article to JAMA about his experience in a small community 5 miles from the international date line. So he cleverly called it 5 miles from tomorrow. But again, there's only so many communities that could be, so identifiability is an issue. So this was published in 2000. He described an incident where it was a 97-year-old came into the clinic where he was working. It's another small community. I can't remember how many hundreds of people it was, but it's tiny. And even though this elder had never met this med student, and the med student was only there a total of 5 weeks, he apparently opened up to the student to say that he felt useless. And that was his chief complaint, that he didn't have any medical problems, he just felt useless. So as the story unfolds, the med student describes in great detail how he was invited to a ceremony steeped in tradition where the family and community members, and he was invited, said goodbye to this elder, who then, and I'm going to quote this, smiles toothlessly, waves, and slowly vanishes into the early morning fog. So he went out to die. And then the med student goes on to discuss end-of-life issues, citing this as an example, a poignant example of how hard it can be with these end-of-life questions. Here's the problem. He made the whole thing up. He made it up. This is complete fiction. And it was when the attending physician, who had been visiting the same community for decades, read the article, and he said, "Whoa, no, that did not happen." And the student admitted that it didn't happen. He thought that JAMA knew that it was fictitious. And no one at JAMA had bothered to ask. And in all fairness, I think this was extremely well written. But the perspective was completely off base. The community was identifiable from the title itself, or at least, you could narrow it down to 2 or 3 places, which is no one was looking out for the community in the writing of this and the publishing of this article. This was not a tradition for this community or the tribes in Alaska. It was a fiction created by others romanticizing what life was like in Alaska. And even though this med student spent 5 weeks in this rural community, he wasn't listening. And he claimed that it was based on discussions that he had with different people in the community. I'm going to put out, this is a personal interpretation. I have no factual basis for this, but my impression is probably that he introduced the topic, and because no one said to him, no, absolutely, we don't do that, no one we know of has ever done that he assumed that it had happened, or claimed that it, you know, he said he talked to people. That doesn't mean that they agree with them. Bottom line. So you have the community is identifiable, that you're making up a story that is not corroborated by the attending physician who knows the community or the community. So you're making other people and whoever reads JAMA to think that this community is one that endorses suicide when people get old. And for those who know Native cultures, and speaking as an Alaska Native, we value our elders. This is against everything that we believe in, so it's even more hurtful at that level. But again, no one picked it up in the process. They just liked this very provocative story and a well-written one, so it got published in JAMA, which how many med students get published in JAMA? It's not many. So I don't know if anybody wants to share their thoughts about it, if you've ever heard of this case or what you think of that.
You briefly talked about this. It's interesting.
It's shocking. Yeah. It's shocking. But, you know, really, if you think about it, there were distant wrongs of minority populations. So the Nazis studied Jews and a lot of disenfranchised European populations that they put in concentration camps. Tuskegee was done amongst African Americans in a very poor community without a lot of access to other options for healthcare or health information. So that led to the legal basis for human subject protections. And that, in total, is a good thing. It's a very good thing. However, these more recent incidents of Havasupai and 5 Miles from Tomorrow that have specifically affected Native communities, small, isolated, identifiable Native communities, it's leading towards this push for an expanded tribal or community protection. So this is played out in a number of ways. Since Havasupai especially, any research conducted in an IHS facility, which Havasupai was an IHS clinic, has to go through the IHS review board, and they do not just consider human subjects, they also consider tribal. Now that's a good start. However, a lot of tribes have taken it one step further to say, if you're going to do research in our community, you have to get approval from our review board. So they're often have different names, but it's essentially the same concept as an institutional review board, but they're also making sure that not only when the research is conducted, that people are aware of what's going to happen and able to fully give. Informed consent is really a great expression, because you have to be able to say yes or no when you know what's going to be involved. It's got to be informed consent. That's step one. But even later, when you're looking at sharing the data or results of the research, that the community is still involved. that if it's going to involve implications to the community, that they should have a say before it's published, or even a press release on it. There have been other examples in Alaska about alcohol abuse in Native communities, and it's a problem, but it's one that we, as Native communities, should be able to decide how we talk about it. And that's not necessarily in university institutional review boards' radar. I mean, they're just unaware of this. And then you also look at publishing. So JAMA, who you'd hope would be a leader, and by the way, I know I throw out acronyms. So it's the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's one of the most prestigious medical journals in the U.S., the world. You know, they got duped by a well-written story that has implications for the community. So on every level, I think it's important for Native people to assert their rights to have their voice heard. So I wanted to leave lots of time. I can go into a lot more detail if you want, but I just wanted to start things off with the background and how we got to where we are, and then figure out what's best moving forward. So I don't know if there are questions or comments.
If you have questions, you can put them in the chat room too. I'm willing to let Dr. Wescott know.
Dr. Best, have you had any resistance to genetic research amongst tribes, and how have you overcome that if you have?
Yeah, I had to kind of switch to another room and turn off my mute button. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So I wondered if you encountered resistance amongst tribal communities for genetic research, and if you've been able to overcome that.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've been lucky, I guess, in the sense that, you know, I started with a long-term relationship with the tribe via my work with the Indian Health Service for a little over 20 years. And so I knew most of the people fairly well, and they knew me relatively well. And I lived in the neighborhood for an additional 10 years or so after working there and taught at the tribal college. So I had some credibility, I think, in that way. And I think at least the Turtle Mountain Band has been relatively accepting of research in general. So I've not really experienced much of any difficulty that way. I think people are more sensitized these days than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But you know, we've tried to accommodate those concerns and anxieties. I've also worked down in South Dakota, and I think there's been more of a reluctance to be involved with genetic research in some communities there, although it's not really been prohibitive. In that, you know, the Strong Heart study has been collecting DNA and doing genetic analysis for decades now, including two of the communities in South Dakota and another one in North Dakota. So it's not like people have been, you know, entirely resistant by any means. There's been very few that offered any real objection to doing that research, but I think it's a very individualized kind of thing. It depends on the investigator, it depends on the question, it depends on the history and so on.
Absolutely. Well, and Turtle Mountain has actually got their own, they're called a research review board, but they'll help other tribes who don't have their own review board and they'll look over any research proposals to help make sure that the tribal perspective is considered and accounted for.
Amber actually commented she's from MHA Nation, and she's the Director of Research and Development at NHSC, and she's working on an RV right now. So.
Oh, you're going to build one in Mandan? It's a lot of work, and I'm doing a simple pre and post survey for a video and the IRB application, and it's taken 2 months to figure out. You think, we're not taking any blood, we're not doing any clinical procedures or even collecting identifiable information from any participants, but that's the reality of having these protections, is that small and large studies have to go through quite a bit.
Ever since they have a RRB code created and they'll be presenting to the full council next month. So, good perspective to have.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions? Well, if there aren't any more,
The model of some of our research code with Turtle Mountain.
yeah, and I think that's the future of research in any country, is tribes, and where it gets a little difficult when about half of the native population is urban. So depending on, I think usually that means that there isn't a tribe specifically to be able to identify and protect human subjects. So that's, I think, the difficulty moving forward. But there's a lot of challenges ahead. I still think it's absolutely critical that we do research in any country. This is just, if you don't have good data, if you don't understand what the problems are, you're going to have a hard time fixing them. So I think research is absolutely critical and something that we should do. We just have to be sensitive to the fact that the usual institutional review board structure and protection for human subjects is not adequate for our communities.
Amber said that the RRB they're working on right now is for birth hold,
Okay.
but she's wondering if you could maybe talk about the advantages and disadvantages associated with an IRB as opposed to an RRB.
This is not an area that I'm super familiar with, but my understanding is that an RRB has far greater ability to place restrictions on research than an IRB does. So every type of review board has the possibility of saying, no, this is illegal, or no, it's unethical, or fix this because it doesn't meet protection standards, based on really development report. But a research review board based in a community has broader ability to say you can't come in. For instance, I know I think it's Pine Ridge Research Review Board says, if you want to do research here, cough up $1,000 or we're not even going to review your proposal. And that in and of itself is a barrier to people who are really just dallying with the idea of research. And there's some, again, I don't know all the details, but there's some additional requirements that a tribally based research review board can put on any researcher coming in, including who owns the data, which if you're federally funded, gets a little complicated. This is another really tricky area. If it's funded, for instance, by the National Institutes of Health, NIH at some level owns the data. Now, a tribe can also own data, and there can be co-ownership, but essentially a research review board has more oomph behind them to say, you can't just use this data any way you want, or in the usual manner, you have to get approvals at more steps than you would with just an IRB. And I don't know, Dr. Best, if you have any experience with the two types.
Yeah, after I've been They have included not only human subjects research, but all kinds of biological research, cultural research, and so on that really doesn't necessarily interact with individuals according to IRB regulations and so on. So, you know, from the tribal sovereignty perspective, they can outline any kind of restrictions they want on research. One of the things that I've tried to communicate when we've discussed this is that, you know, it's easy to put up restrictions, and I think people have to think about the consequences of that. Are they going to unnecessarily inhibit research either on their own reservation or in general? And, you know, some people may think that's a small price to pay, and other big problems and so on, but I think that it's just one more step. I think, Siobhan, when you started, you mentioned that, you know, you had some difficulties with obtaining IRB approval and so on at times, and, you know, in some of our studies we have 8 or 10 different IRBs that we deal with, and they all have slightly different takes on things. They want this word in the consent, they don't want that word, they want back and forth, and it can be a giant mess trying to get through it. I know personally of a number of researchers who wouldn't even consider working in the Indian communities just because they don't want to be involved in, you know, some extra steps. So I think the communities have to think about that, and, you know, if their decision is they just don't care and they don't want any research, that's certainly their prerogative, but, you know, it should at least be considered. As far as the data ownership is concerned, and we've struggled with this greatly, the strong heart study in particular, because NIH has come down relatively hard on us that they want, you know, data sharing, and by that they mean, you know, a publicly available database that can be searched. It's anonymous, of course, but we've already pointed out some of the difficulties with small communities and everything, and not to mention the tribal identity issues that are raised. So we've been trying to work through that with not only NIH, but to come to some accommodation between NIH and the tribes. And frankly, we've been working on it for 10 years or better, and I don't think we've seen a whole lot of progress. But NIH is continuing to work on it, I think, and just most recently, actually earlier this afternoon, I was on a conference call with NIH, and data sharing is still part of the issue that they're trying to work through. So, and I think their attitude has changed just a little bit in the last year or so. So I'm hopeful we'll see some improvement there. That's been my experience.
I agree, and I feel like there's a pendulum swing where, you know, decades ago research was researcher driven. You know, where can I find participants to do the research I want to do? And it's swinging in some ways far over to communities, especially tribal communities, saying, wait, you know, this is my concern or our concern. How can we find someone to study that? And I think hopefully someday we'll meet somewhere in the middle where we can match communities up with researchers who are studying the kinds of things that they're interested in. And I think that's best for both worlds. But it's a big shift for both populations, researchers and communities. So it's going to be ugly for a while we work out those things. The NIH, I think, is a little bit more difficult. They're mostly used to large databases, and it makes a certain amount of sense if you're using tax dollars to do research, that data doesn't just get hidden away somewhere where no one else can benefit from it. But if, you know, you have 20,000 participants in a large East Coast study, identifiability is not really an issue, and that makes total sense that it be available. I think with tribal communities, the NIH has not really figured out why there's this resistance. And the end result of that, you know, like Dr. Beth said, is that, you know, researchers are not interested necessarily in working in any country, and any country isn't necessarily interested in working with researchers. I think both of those need to change, and the bottom line, what's missing or absolutely essential is trust. You know, Dr. Best put his time in. He may not have been for that community, but he was there for decades, working with people so that they could know where he's coming from, and not just somebody who walked in like, hey, we're going to study your gene. It's understandable, but who has that ability? I mean, there's probably just a handful in the country. So that's another thing that needs to change.
Thank you. I have just a couple other points I'd like to quickly make, if I could. One is that I think that the whole idea of encouraging and matchmaking it, if you will, between the investigator and the community is really important. I tried to emphasize that with folks at Turtle Mountain in particular, that they could easily put up invitations basically to researchers on the website or whatever, saying, these are the top 10 questions that we'd really like to see research done on, and we'd love to work with whoever's interested. We don't care if you're from Siberia or wherever you're located. We're inviting you to come. These are important, situations for us, problems for us, and we'd like to work on. The other quick point is that I think that there's something to be said for doing things as a community and as a society, but we also, I think, need to recognize that individuals have certain rights and prerogatives as well. And so I think sometimes when the tribe will completely prohibit or ban research in a particular area, whatever, for all of their members, at least some members can and do object to that. They like to exercise their own free will and decide whether they want to take part, as long as it's not something that's dangerous to them or otherwise unreasonable. So just those other 2 points I was thinking of.
Absolutely, and thanks for sharing, because I think of everyone involved in this webinar, you have the most experience with research, and definitely the Strong Heart study is a good example of the power of persistence and what research can help us really optimize care for Native people. But those things aren't easy, and it takes years and years and years of hard work before you get any results. Okay, looks like the chat room is quieting down, but I appreciate all of you being involved today, and I know this is going to be available as a recording, and I appreciate if anyone has questions later, please feel free to contact me.
I will put Dr. Wescott's email in our chat room, so feel free to contact her through there.